According to the customs of this university, we open this academic session with the following words: Spiritus Sancti Gratia, illuminet sensus et corda nostra. Please take a seat. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you here at Radboud University, either here in this room or connected via Zoom or following the ceremony via live stream. A special word of welcome to you, Rasenberg, and the people who are entitled to assist you in the defense of your thesis, the paronyms, Marlijn Terbeke, Anita Slonimska. Welcome to all of you in this session. In turn, I will present the members of the examination board. Before that, I already present two persons, the supervisor of this thesis, Professor Ujurek, and the co-supervisor, Dr. Dingermansen. They are not going to ask any questions, as they already asked a lot of them in the last couple of years. I now give the floor to the candidate for the degree of doctor.
With the permission of the doctorate board, and in order to obtain the degree of doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my dissertation entitled Mutual Understanding from a Multimodal and Interactional Perspective. For my thesis, I investigated dialogues, and in particular, how people make sure that they understand each other. And to show you how rich and complex that process can be, I will start out with an example. So it's a real-life example which happened when I was hiking in the Alps last summer. And as I was struggling up a hill, I encountered another hiker and I asked him, how far is it to the village? To which he replied, another 300 meters. But note that in the mountains there are different ways to talk about distance, and I was unsure how to understand that utterance. So to clarify this, I asked, another 300 meters up, using a gesture to depict the ascent in altitude, so to depict the elevation gain. But luckily he replied, I mean 300 meters further, using a gesture to depict the route along the path. So from just this short little dialogue, we can see two key phenomena that might be at play or that have been argued to play a key role in establishing mutual understanding. First of all, we can see that people sometimes repeat each other, a process that I call alignment. And we can look at this at the level of speech, but also in terms of people's gestures. Secondly, we can have a look at the structure of the dialogue. And what we see then is that this turn was somehow problematic. I had difficulties interpreting it. So I then replied with a request for clarification. I offered an understanding that the other person could then confirm the repair solution. So this process is called repair. And we use it all the time in dialogue. On average, no 5 minutes go by without it. So we use it to quickly repair problems with hearing or understanding. So now coming to the main question, how do people make sure they understand each other? Well, traditionally in psycholinguistic research, people have focused on individuals and individual processes. So on the one hand, they've studied production processes, for example, looking at how people choose particular words depending on who they talk to make sure that they might understand it. And on the other hand, comprehension. For example, looking at how people arrive at the correct meaning of a word if it's ambiguous, and how gestures might play a role there. Yet in my thesis, I aim to look beyond these individual processes and instead focus on how people collaborate to make sure they understand each other, where I zoom in on those strategies, alignment and repair. And while, of course, there is already some work on alignment and repair, a lot of that has focused on speech. And what I've done in my thesis is to combine it, looking at speech and gesture, and see how these two modalities can be used to negotiate understanding in dialogue. And these two phenomena, alignment and repair, I've studied them across different chapters, and I will now briefly present some of the main results of those. So starting with alignment. Investigating alignment is tricky, especially because there are many different terms and definitions out there linked to various theoretical ideas. People have studied it under the header of alignment, but also mimicry, accommodation, behavior matching, the list goes on. So in chapter 2, I started out by creating a framework that would help us to be more clear about what we mean when we speak of alignment, and as such to provide conceptual tools to further investigate it. So to explain this framework, I'd like you to imagine two people who take turns in a dialogue. And then we can start comparing those turns in terms of alignment, if people are aligning their behavior. And a lot of prior work has focused on alignment of form. So, for example, two people using the exact same word. And this comes from the idea that people are primed. When I hear a certain word, I might be more likely to use it later on as well. But with this framework, I've tried to point out that there is more to consider than just the dimension of form. For example, we can look at modality, ask whether people align in speech, but perhaps also in gesture, and perhaps even across these two different modalities. Furthermore, we can ask whether those words or gestures, even if they look alike, are actually used to talk about the same thing, or perhaps mean something else. And also something that has often been overlooked is the structural relationship between utterances. For example, alignment could have a totally different function if it occurs in response to a question, compared to if it happens across unrelated turns which are further apart in the dialogue. And this then relates to the dimensions of sequence and time. So using this conceptual framework, I was then in a better position to investigate alignment in different modalities, speech and gesture, and how it's used to establish mutual understanding. And before I go into this question in chapter 3, I first have to tell you what kind of interactions I've been studying in my thesis, in chapter 3 as well as chapter 4 and 5. So what I did is I asked people to come to the lab to work on a task with another participant. And in this task, they took turns to describe and find fribbles, blue 3D objects that they've never seen before. And as you can imagine, this is a challenging task. And that provides us with opportunities to study the kind of strategies that people use to make sure that they understand each other. So using this data set, I investigated alignment of speech and gesture in chapter 3. And I found that overall, people are most likely to align in both speech and gesture to refer to any fribble at some point in the interaction. So multimodal alignment, alignment of speech and gesture, was most common. But how do they do that? And also, why would they prefer to use alignment in both modalities if they could also just use the same words? Well, to show you that, I will show you an example. So here the participants are talking about the highlighted part of the fribble, where one participant checks whether she found the right fribble by asking, yes, and with a plateau like this on the right side, where she produces this gesture. So it's a gesture that depicts the horizontal orientation of that part of the fribble. And the other participant then responded by saying, yes, a sort of circular plateau indeed. And she produced this gesture. So what we see here is alignment in terms of speech, because both people said plateau, as well as alignment in gesture. They used similar gestures, though they were not identical, because the second gesture had a somewhat different form. There was this circular movement that was used to depict the circular shape of the subpart. So what we see here is that while alignment is typically studied in terms of exact repetition or mimicry, it is actually variation in form that can also be used to negotiate understanding in dialogue. So turning to the topic of repair. In chapter 4, I asked, how do people repair problems with understanding using speech and gesture? And to show you the kind of multimodal strategies that people used here, I'll show you another example. So here, the fribble is described by saying, on the front you have a big block, using a tracing gesture to trace the outline of that block. And to clarify this term, the other participant asks, just that go straight down like this, making a gesture to depict the vertical orientation of that block. So this is a repair initiation. It is a request for clarification where the participant offers an understanding, and he does so using speech and gesture. So it's a multimodal understanding that is offered for the other person to confirm. And this is then indeed confirmed, not just by saying yes, but by combining yes exactly with a repetition of that exact same gesture. And by doing so, this person specifically shows that the multimodal description of the other participant was correct, not just the speech that was provided. But of course, this is just one way that people go about resolving misunderstandings. And there are others. So in chapter 5, I set out to investigate this in a more systematic manner, looking at how much effort goes into it for people to resolve these kind of troubles. And I looked at effort in terms of speech as well as gesture. So in this one example that we saw already, we see that the person who initiates repair does quite a lot of work in speech as well as gesture, making it easy for their partner to simply confirm it. But what people can also do is just say, what? And leave it up to the other person to do all of the work in speech and gesture to resolve the trouble. So what we find here is a sort of division of labor between people in such a way that the more the person who initiates repair does, the less is to be done by their partner and vice versa. And in this chapter, I also found that the strategy where the person who initiates repair does most is preferred, and that this is also the most efficient strategy. And with that, I mean that it requires the smallest amount of effort by both people. So it's like a group level efficiency. So putting all of these findings together, I hope to have convinced you that language use is a form of joint action. And you can think of it as people dancing together. It looks smooth, but people work together to form complex sequences of moves. And dialogue is similar in that sense. People coordinate their multimodal moves and their use of speech and gesture to make sure they understand each other. And this thesis has shown how alignment and repair are used in that process, providing quantitative and qualitative insights into how people use speech and gesture as part of alignment and repair to establish mutual understanding. Having presented this summary of my dissertation, I return the floor to the rector.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Professor Van Rooij, Chair of the Manuscript Committee.
Thank you very much. Esteemed candidate, thank you very much for your clear exposition. I want to start by complimenting you on a very impressive, fascinating, and well-written PhD thesis. I much enjoyed reading it. Your thesis stands out, in my opinion, in several ways. I think it shows a wonderful mix of conceptual reflection, methodological innovation, and also a multidisciplinary mindset. And my compliments for this. I know how challenging that can be. I will start, not surprisingly, with a somewhat theoretical question. I'll say it up front to align before we start. So in your thesis, as you also explained in your presentation, you used the Fribbles paradigm. And I've personally also always been fascinated by this paradigm and others similar to it, in how, in my opinion, it demonstrates that people can so very quickly converge on novel ways of communicating about novel things or things that have no conventional labels yet. And as a theoretical modeler, I struggle with explaining this ability. And there's existing approaches. I know also at least some of them you are aware, since you cite them, maybe others not. But these existing approaches, they fail to actually explain this ability. So I'm thinking, for instance, of cognitive agent-based models, of which I know you know a little bit, or maybe even a lot, and then you will share that with me. Two examples. So on the one hand, there's models based on, for instance, reinforcement learning, and there we find that they need many more trials of learning or more loops of feedback or interactions than people actually use. That is, they take on the orders of thousands of such interactions, whereas people only take a handful, as you also demonstrate. On the other hand, we also have models based on pragmatic inference, so agents that try to reason about what would I say if I was in, or what would I gesture in this situation. And, but we find that those models don't actually converge on mutual understanding. And also they assume that our minds solve intractable computations, which aren't really plausible. And you would expect that actually these models would do better based on these last assumptions, but they don't. So my question to you is based on your observations, your empirical observations and your expertise, your insights, and your analysis, conceptual analysis on alignment and multimodal repair. do you have any recommendations for modelers on things they may be overlooking so far? And I really would like to invite you to freely speculate. That's basically what theoretical modelers do as well. So feel free to speculate, and I would just really welcome such recommendations.
Dear opponent, thank you for your compliments. It's a tricky question. I know a bit about this kind of modeling work. It's definitely not my expertise. My first thought is that I think a process that happens in interaction, which is hard to model or is perhaps not modeled yet so far in these approaches that you mentioned, is what we would generally describe as grounding, the grounding process. So, of course, you can feed a model 20 times, maybe thousands times, like a particular referential expression for a fribble, even if it's an abstract one, something like robot, and maybe at some point it will learn. But what we do in interaction is not just say robot a whole bunch of times. We say robot, and then the other person either gives a signal that they have understood it, and therefore it becomes grounded in the common ground, or if they don't, they might repair it. So a process that I've seen sometimes in the data is that they might even start out with such an abstract label. One person just says robot, and the other person is like, what? And then through this process of repair, they unpack it. They then go on to describe the little individual parts, like, oh, you can see this part as the eyes, you can see that part as this, etc. So it's through that collaborative process, which is something that happens in the interaction rather than in just the mind of one individual, that they make sure they converge on a final label. And how to put that into those models, yeah, that's a very tough question, and I think I would definitely have to leave that up to the experts, but maybe I hope this helps already.
Can I follow up?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so thank you. It's very, very interesting, and I agree it's a very tricky question also how to implement it. So just to follow up, so I see that indeed in reinforcement where you just try and you just hear no, that's not it. I see that is completely not in line with how people approach this task. But still to follow up on this other kind of model based on pragmatic inference. So that tries to really, okay, what could the other person mean? Because if I would mean what the other person means, I would do this. And so I'm trying, for instance, with the signal in your presentation, the person makes this signal. And what we notice that if, of course, we model that abstractly in the models, is that a challenge that these abstract agents encounter is that they don't know actually when they understand each other. Mm-hmm. So you say that the other person may signal, oh, I understood you, but what we notice is that how do you actually explain that people know that they correctly understood the other if they don't already share the conventions? They may think, so they may falsely believe that they understand each other when they do not. We know this also happens, of course, in real life. I don't know, yeah. So I was wondering, can you say a bit more on that aspect, what may be missing or what may be in your paradigm or in your observations, or you say, oh, this is how people actually resolve in such situations that they falsely believe to be understanding each other.
So they resolve that they are falsely believing each other.
Or they prevent that. They go away thinking we understood each other while they do not. How do we ensure that they actually understand each other when they believe that they understand each other?
So I think speaking for this data set, at least, people seem to be highly motivated to make sure that they understand each other. So perhaps you could even think of it, especially if you would want to model it, in terms of a sort of threshold. Like they have to be certain, at least to a particular degree, before they will produce a signal of understanding. And then in real interactions, you might go into some politeness issues, because it can happen that people, even after repairing again and again, they still don't get it. But there is a sort of maximum. At some point, they might also give up. But overall, I do think that people would continue to ask if the certainty level is not high enough yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Professor Brone, Katholieke Universiteit Leuven.
Thank you very much. Esteemed candidate, let me start by saying that you truly impressed me with this excellent dissertation, which really was a joy to read. And this work stands out in many ways, as my colleague already mentioned, and I will pick out two aspects of your work. First, the dissertation manages to present the results of the studies in an exceptionally concise manner, without sacrificing clarity, transparency, and a good sense of the data that build the foundation of your studies. All in all, it's a very compact dissertation of only about 140 pages, which at first sight may seem a bit limited for a PhD thesis, but being short doesn't mean it's short of ideas and short of results, and that's very important. This is a triple distilled, powerful piece of text, which I really like. After reading the studies, it becomes clear that this is a rich and coherent whole that combines rigorous empirical analyses with an in-depth theoretical reflection. To put it really bluntly, it's lean and mean, and I like it, so it's very nice. Second, the choice of the two sets of phenomena in your study, which may not be that straightforward at first sight, actually provides a test case par excellence for the fundamental claim that is put forward in your dissertation, that social interaction is a collaborative, a multimodal undertaking that involves a substantial degree of real-time negotiation of distributed agency. The fact that both phenomena, alignment and other initiated repair, have been studied widely in sometimes radically different frameworks and methodological traditions, in fact provides a rich landscape to start from and explore commonalities, discrepancies, and potential blind spots also in the literature. And you really navigate very elegantly throughout these different frameworks, backgrounds, and methods using this really mixed methods approach, and you do so very consistently and convincingly throughout your dissertation. Which actually brings me to my first question, and that is, in your chapters 3 and 4, you really convincingly show how to use a mixed methods approach to do this type of analysis of alignment. And I was wondering, in chapter 5, you do not do so. Mm-hmm. So my main question, which is actually an invitation to really reflect on this, based on what you learned from chapter 5, what could a qualitative approach add to the results of that chapter? Do you have any specific hypotheses that you could test using that kind of data and approach that you've chosen? That would be my general invitation to reflect on this.
Dear opponent, thank you very much for your compliments. I think in terms of chapter 5, the order of it was also deliberately first chapter 4 and then chapter 5. Because in chapter 4, I present an analysis of the kind of strategies that people use as part of repair. And in chapter 5, I then quantify it by looking at effort. But I think the results of chapter 5 would then still be seen sort of against the findings of chapter 4. So it's not just that, of course we can look at the effort involved in doing repair, but it's also important to really know what's going on inside of the dialogues. How are the gestures used to combine with speech? Where you get also into questions of how the gesture relates to the speech in terms of semantics, for example, and whether it adds information that is not expressed in speech and vice versa. And this is a question that often comes up for people who look at chapter 5, sort of the division of labor between the modalities there. But I think chapter 4 already nicely shows that it can be done in many different ways. So the example in the presentation with the ja precies and the gesture is one where the gesture clearly adds information. And still, because of the simultaneity of those speech and gesture productions, it's quick, right? So I think we can think of this division of labor in terms of the efficiency principles against the qualitative findings from chapter 4.
Okay, thank you. And now I give the floor to Professor Fernandes, Universiteit van Amsterdam.
Esteemed candidate, I would like to join the other members of the committee in congratulating you as well for your thesis, for all the research that you have done over these years, and the final product, the final thesis that you have put together, which I agree is an impressive piece of work. I think that both the theoretical and the empirical contributions of the thesis are an inspiration for researchers, including myself. I feel inspired by this work and to work on aspects that follow up on your discoveries. And I think altogether they make a very substantial and important contribution towards our understanding of multimodal communication and mapping out how multimodal communication works. So congratulations on that. I would like to ask you a few questions. I'll start by one that also concerns chapter 5, as you were discussing now. And so in this chapter, and maybe also a bit in chapter 4, so you are analyzing repair sequences. You're coding your data by identifying the initiation phase and the solution phase of repair sequences. So this is a framework that has been defined for the speech modality, right? And you are, well, you please tell me otherwise if not, right? But you, if I understood you correctly, you do code your data by identifying these repair sequences on the speech modality, right? And then you look at what is going on in the gestural modality and so on. You can complement my my maybe not complete characterization, but I was wondering, given your multimodal perspective, wouldn't it make sense to have a more multimodal view of repair in general, right? So do these notions that, in my knowledge, have come from the speech modality truly characterize what's going on? So what is multimodal repair, basically? How could we characterize multimodal repair? What are the units that we would need to identify? Can we just directly transfer ideas that might have come from the speech modality to the multimodal way of viewing communication?
Dear opponent, thank you very much for your compliments. So I will start by discussing sort of the background of early work on repair and also the kind of conventions for coding it and finding it in dialogue. So the very start of it all, indeed, it's very speech-centered. So the early work in conversation analysis mainly looked at written forms of transcripts, so looking at the speech. This also had a kind of practical side to it, mainly because they used recordings like of audio rather than just also video. But over the years, this has changed quite a bit. So also within conversation analysis, there have been more multimodal approaches, looking at how, for example, facial expressions can be used as part of repair. So there's quite a lot of work on that already. And furthermore, more recently, also successful attempts to look at repair in sign languages, where they find that actually the same sort of core coding schemes, where the structure of the dialogue, like a trouble source, an initiation, and a solution, can be applied to interactions in any modality. It works for sign language as well. So how I've then done it in my dissertation for this particular data set, I did use the speech utterances as kind of the annotations that were used to indicate repair. And this is mainly because there were no instances where there was just a gesture without speech. But in principle, it would have been possible. So what I've done is I already had speech annotations. I used those together with looking at the whole context, the video, but also, of course, the multimodal conduct of participants, to define whether something is a repair initiation and what is the repair solution. And these annotations of repair were then linked to the speech annotations, just also for practical reasons, for the analyses to be able to get the speech and the amount of speech in there. And also gestures were then annotated, but separately from annotating repair. And these were later on linked to, separately from looking at the speech turns per se. And the gestures were later on linked to the repair annotations to really have per unit, so per initiation, speech and gesture included.
Okay, so if I understood you correctly, you think that the current frameworks for thinking about repair and analyzing its internal components function well for multimodal interaction and for repair with different types of modalities.
I think so. One small side note, but which is maybe something that can be difficult, is that I've looked at open requests, restricted requests, and restricted offers. But we can also find implicit, even more implicit requests, which are more implicit than open requests, like "ha," for example. And this is usually something that happens in the facial, like bodily signals. So, for example, if you are talking, and I might just stare at you and make a face like that, this can work as a repair without me saying anything or producing kind of over manual gestures. So we can discuss kind of whether those three categories are sufficient or if we should also have this implicit request category. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I now give the virtual floor to Dr. Fusaroli, Aarhus University, by Zoom.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, your dissertation was a pleasure to read, and in particular, I appreciated the very systematic attempt to, at the same time, keep track of very nuanced details in the interaction, but also scaling up the approach to full corpora with the humility of acknowledging shortcomings and advantages in both perspectives. And from multimodality to complementary coordination, you tackled some of the hardest issues in the field and worked really hard on understanding how they work both in the local examples and then enlarge your perspective, quantifying them across the whole corpus and challenging existing models. And this is truly a sign of a very talented and courageous researchers. And this is what we need to push the field forward. So congratulations on your work so far. As to my question, I truly appreciated the idea that you push forward that gesture and alignment are resources within a conversation, are flexibly applicable devices. And I think this is quite right. However, this is also a challenge to a systematic understanding of conversations. So for instance, in your first empirical paper on how novel referential expressions are established, you show the very strong prevalence of co-speech gesture alignment. But we also know from previous experiments or from old school telephone calls that these can happen without gesture as well. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit more on how we gain a systematic understanding of how the context changes these findings and how your work is actually helping us understand what happened in the previous studies better.
Dear opponent, thank you very much for your compliments. As for your question, the notion of using speech and gesture and alignment and repair in flexible ways is, I think, difficult to study in systematic and quantitative ways, and it's precisely why I've also used qualitative methods in my thesis. And for the use of gesture, where we might also do without it, as you mentioned, I think it's beneficial to look at precisely where do people then rely on these gestures? What are the sort of communicative demands, the communicative challenges that sort of push people to use this modality? And I think some of the qualitative examples in chapter 3 might get there a little bit. So there's, for example, one example where quite late in the interaction, a person has somewhat difficulty referring to a fribble. It appears as though they sort of lost the word. They have some difficulties finding the word. And this is the moment where they then use a gesture, in fact, a gesture that was used before in the interaction by the other partner, to still describe this fribble. So that's where we then found an instance of kind of late gestural alignment, and the qualitative work can sort of help us to understand what's going on and how people flexibly use different modalities. Does this answer your question?
Yep. Thank you. Yes, very much.
Okay, thank you. I now give the floor to Dr. Holler, Oxfam Institute of Psycholinguistics.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, dear Marlou, on the risk of sounding like a parrot, I would also very much like to congratulate you on your thesis. I think it's a wonderful piece of work, and despite even knowing it from various presentations beforehand, I was still very much impressed by it. Also for the same reasons that have struck my colleagues, namely that it's incredibly concisely written and very, very clearly written, and that it taps a lot of different aspects of the kind of interaction process, not just staying with grounding and successful communication, but also delving into the difficulties, and at the same time, yeah, mixing this kind of quantitative and qualitative approaches, which I think makes it really, really rich and nice and convincing, and kind of caters for different audiences, if you want. And on top of that, it addresses an area which really had been hardly researched before your thesis, so it makes an incredibly important contribution because of that. So, congratulations. But, as you know, we're meant to tease you with questions. So my first one would be, you propose this kind of integrative framework, which I very much like, but you focus on co-speech and, speech and gesture alignment on the semantic level. At the same time, you mention in your introduction, on page 29 to be precise, that there is also socio-affective functions of alignment. And you mention that in that very one sentence, but then don't really elaborate on that at all. And as I'm sure you know, there is a huge literature from the 70s or 60s even, starting with Albert Schefflin and postural congruency in therapeutic interactions, all the way through to Chartrand and Bard in much more recently, looking at foot tapping and things like that, and a plethora of studies in between that have looked at that kind of alignment level. And so my question is, have you omitted it just for sake of simplicity? And if so, do you think it would, to have a truly integrative approach, not be important to also bring that in a little bit more, and especially to look also at whether there are any kind of joint mechanisms that underpin these different forms of alignments, which could also be scored on at least some of the dimensions you outline? And if so, would that have perhaps changed the insights you gained from your work? So for example, to make it a bit more concrete, on page 27, where you have got your photos, where you first introduce alignment, the meat-eating Chad, where it's very nicely illustrated how the two people align on a gestural level. But if you look at their postures, for example, they're absolutely not aligned. One of them crosses the arms, the other one has a very open posture, so almost the opposite. And even when B kind of reproduces the gesture, he still crosses his arms with his other hand. Is that meaningful in any way? Does that reflect something on the stance towards the interaction, which could then influence the alignment on a semantic level, or do you think it's completely separate systems? That's my question.
Dear opponent, thank you for the lovely summary of the thesis. So for chapter 2, I think some of it is practical reasons. So surely we focused on the lexical and gestural modality in that chapter, also because we review quite a lot of work to sort of illustrate the paper. And I think if we would have extended that to also facial expressions, body, etc., it would have been too much for just that chapter. And of course we looked at gesture and speech because that sort of is used in the rest of the thesis. But it was not just practical. I think there was also, I think writing up that chapter, and especially the introduction part where we kind of try to get some clarity in the different theoretical approaches, I see this work on sort of mimicry and how people, like I do my hair like this, you do your hair like this, those kind of behaviors and how they become synchronized in dialogue. A lot of that work kind of still uses theoretical ideas and empirical investigations that are quite in line with a lot of the priming work. Mm-hmm. And this then altogether, I think I've sort of put under the header of work in psychology, where people look at direct mappings accounts, the idea that we subconsciously, unconsciously just copy each other's behavior without necessarily being aware of that. And also, importantly, without necessarily using that as a resource or strategy in like the turn-taking in the dialogue to get that understanding. So I think in that sense, it is quite separate from the kind of alignment that I have been studying in my thesis, though they are not mutually exclusive. I mean, they could still be going on at the same time. But for this particular example, the meat-eating chat, I think there it's precisely an example that can show that we use alignment of speech and gesture sort of deliberately to make sure that we understand each other, and that this behavioral posture, the way we sit, etc., might serve other functions, might indeed have, as you mentioned, have to do more with affiliation, like signaling that I like you or I don't like you, these kind of processes that have been studied quite a lot, of course. So I think there might be a play at the same time. I'm not sure if people are aware of that and take that into sort of constructing understanding in the dialogue.
So your interpretation of that case example, for example, would have been exactly the same, even if you had applied a more holistic approach and taken that in. So you would have still seen the same alignment in gesture, and maybe you would have talked about the other alignment on a different level, rather than it somehow mutually influencing each other.
I would probably, if I had approached it more holistically, have noted it. You can, of course, describe it. But the difficult thing is that you cannot, unlike we can do for the dialogue, we cannot really see how people's behavior is contingent on the other person's behavior. Whereas for speech, it's clear that with my turn following your turn, it's a response to what you were saying, what you were doing. But with this, I cannot really make that case. So I think I would just describe it and then leave it up to psychologists and to further investigate that topic and how it relates to these more socio-affective processes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Dr. Hoetjes.
Esteemed candidate, it's becoming very repetitive by now, but let me start by congratulating you on the work that you've done, resulting in this wonderful thesis. Like my colleagues, I think that there are many strong points to your work. For example, the fact that you combine theoretical rigor with empirical studies, and that you conducted both quantitative and qualitative analyses. And another strong point for me, and this may sound kind of trivial, but I really think it's not, is that your thesis really reads well. You make a really clear point from start to finish about how social interaction is collaborative and multimodal, and your thesis really feels balanced in the topics that it discusses and the point that you're trying to make. Also, again, this may sound really trivial, but I don't think it is. Your writing style is really pleasant. So it's not really often that you read academic work and enjoy it. But in this case, that actually happens. So my compliments. But of course, I also have a question about your work, several, but I'll just stick with the first one for now. So in your thesis, you divide the gestures that are produced into three groups: iconic gestures, didactic gestures, and other gestures. And in the analysis in chapter 3, you then focus on iconic gestures. Of course, when people are describing these fribbles, these weird-looking objects, it's quite likely that they'll produce many iconic gestures, right? Given that these are such strange, concrete objects. So I guess it's not really strange that you focus on iconic gestures in your work. And also a nice thing about iconic gestures is that they have various aspects with regard to form or meaning that people can align with, or not, or to a larger extent or not. However, this is all in the context of people describing such weird objects in the lab. If you think about a more natural or more frequently occurring communicative context where people just talk to each other face to face, people tend to produce many beat gestures rather than iconic gestures. And beat gestures are thought to be sort of have less semantic meaning than iconic gestures. Are also generally considered to be more simple in form than iconic gestures. And with this in mind, I was wondering what your thoughts are about the extent to which your findings can be applied to more naturalistic settings outside of the lab, and specifically settings in which you would expect people to produce many beat gestures. So, in other words, do you think that there can also be alignment in beat gestures? If so, what would this look like? How would you measure this? I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about this.
Dear opponent, thank you very much for your compliments. So beat gestures. In my thesis, I have grouped them under the header of other. And there were a few, but not many. So indeed, in naturalistic interactions, we will surely expect to find more of those. Whether people align on those, I think they surely can. It depends how you define alignment. And I think there chapter 2 comes in. So using that framework, we can still talk about the dimensions on which beat gestures can be aligned between people. So we can look at it in terms of form. How are they beating? Is it with one hand, like often it's something like this, can also be like this. So we can look at the form of the hand shapes. We can of course look at it in terms of time and see whether sort of the rhythm at which people are beating might also become somehow synchronized between people. So there are some approaches there that I think can be used. Perhaps there the meaning level becomes less relevant. And that's then the main difference between the kind of alignment of iconic gestures that I have been studying. But I think using chapter 2, you could still define alignment for beat gestures and go about studying it. And I think it does sort of match some work that has already been going on, not perhaps necessarily looking at beat gestures, but looking at to what extent people might align their prosodic rhythms, for example. So there's quite a lot of work within linguistics at the speech level already. And given that, of course, beat gestures tend to synchronize with the prosodic patterns of speech, we might use similar approaches to go about studying that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to a very, very efficient exchange of questions, answers, and I think all kinds of things, thoughts, I would say. I would like to continue with the second round of questions, and I would like to give the floor first to Professor Brone, Katholieke Universiteit Leuven.
Thank you. I'm actually glad that you went back to chapter 2 in your last answer, because that's exactly what I wanted to do for my second question as well. More specifically on the relationship between this second chapter and chapters 3 and 4. In this second chapter, you go into great length in providing an integrative framework for the analysis of alignment, where you take into account different frameworks, different methodological backgrounds, and you do not subscribe to any of these theoretical frameworks in that positioning. Right? But then when we look at chapters 3 and 4, you do seem to go very much in the direction of one of these traditions, right? When you talk about conceptual pacts, for instance, which is very much on the grounding side of the continuum and not obviously the priming side. So my main question here is, what are the implications of that choice for your analysis? So are there any implications, and what can you take from this, or what can we take from this positioning, which seems somewhat different from what you mentioned in chapter 2?
I think just to first sort of describe why chapter 2 was written like that, and it seems to be in a bit of a contrast to the later chapters. I think for a sort of conceptual paper like that, to really put out the whole spectrum, I think it's best to sort of stay neutral there. For the people who read that paper, I think, I hope at least that it's something that reaches a lot of people in many different disciplines. So then ascribing already to one particular best way of doing it was not what I had in mind for that chapter. I especially hope to give people the tools to come up with their own definitions. I'm also not saying there's this definition that you should use. But then, of course, in chapter 3, indeed, I agree that it is much more towards the grounding side. And I think that's also not necessarily because I think that's the way to do it or the best way to study it, but from my interest in especially the dimensions of sequence, meaning, and modality, that naturally follows. Because if you start looking at the sequential relationships of turns in dialogue, then the priming account doesn't really offer any tools to study that. We can only look at whether people repeat each other, how often that happens, if it happens less, if there's more time passing by, etc. So by sort of having a clear research interest, that drew me towards that theoretical camp, so to say, if you want to speak of camps. And then for the implications of that for my work, I think it has helped to go into the data in a sort of qualitative, more micro-analysis kind of way, and that has revealed different ways of how people use alignment in interaction. But of course it also means that I cannot argue whether priming was playing a role there, yes or no. We simply don't know. Of course, I study these cases and I make a case for that, looking at how the behavior of one person is contingent on what the other person says. It appears to be that people use speech and gesture and alignment as strategies to deal with particular communicative challenges. There might also be higher levels of activation. I don't know. That's the implication of this approach.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's a very convincing answer. And to be clear, I fully agree with you and I fully follow your choice. I think you can even be more explicit about this, I would say. So, thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Dr. Fusaroli, Aarhus University.
You, in your thesis, you advocate for a radical multimodal approach, right? And show very persuasively the role of gesture in complementing speech and in also doing some of the work without speech. An even more radical reading of your argument would then imply that body posture and eye gaze and prosody, etc., should also be included in your analysis, right? However, again, that might come in the way of systematic corpus analysis, right? Because we might need to go back, as you were suggesting in your previous answer, to a small sequence in the corpus, and it might challenge interpretability of having to analyze a lot of different channels at the same time in a large corpus. So, how do you think we should proceed if we want to take the whole of multimodality seriously in trying to combine qualitative and large-scale analysis?
That's a big challenge, I think, for the field that you are addressing here. Just something that comes to mind first, I think there is already efforts into looking at many different channels, so to say, at the same time. Some people here in this room, amongst others Judith Holler, is really working hard to look at various signals in the face, blinking, frowning, eye gaze, nodding, all of those sort of at the same time. And I think there's different ways to go about that. You can do it with a lot of coding. You need a whole team of assistants to go into Elon and code all of that. There's now, of course, also people who try to get at that with sort of state-of-the-art techniques, using open pose, etc., to get at those signals. And I think those are very important approaches to really study in a quantitative way how all of these signals can be combined, getting at this more systematic analysis that I think you are looking for. But of course, probably you would expect me to say this, is that I think it should still be combined with looking at it qualitatively, studying how those different signals are used in interaction and how they relate to the behavior of the other person to manage turn-taking, to manage mutual understanding. So I think with all of the efforts in the field, we are slowly getting there, but it's a difficult job.
Thanks.
I now give the floor to Professor Fernandes, Universiteit van Amsterdam.
Yes, I would like to go back to chapter 3 and to ask you a rather concrete, I think, more methodological question. So you make the choice of operationalizing alignment as overlap in the speech modality, while on the gestural modality you focus on meaning, on referential alignment. And I was wondering different things. So why one is whether this is purely for simplicity reasons, for the difficulty of looking at form alignment, etc., of gestures and so on, whether it's just for simplicity reasons. What do you think that the consequences are of having made that choice, whether you might be missing something or there is still some other aspects that, for instance, would be worth analyzing when there is alignment at the level of meaning gesturally, but not at the level of form? Is that also some kind of misalignment in some interesting way? So it's one question, and I was also wondering whether this choice of operationalizing alignment slightly differently in the two modalities is what prevented you from studying cross-modal alignment, because you stay within each of the modalities, right? So if you could give me some details about this, I'll be happy.
I will start by first clarifying a little bit the different operationalizations and why we use those for speech and gesture. So for speech, indeed, we look at form overlap, to be precise, the same lemma. So we lemmatize the speech and look if they overlap. For gesture, we didn't. And this choice followed from an exploratory investigation of form overlap. So in the earlier rounds of the interaction, where most of the gestures were occurring, I did look closely at how gestures overlap in terms of form, if they are about the same reference. So first I looked at, okay, where are people gesturing about the same part of the fribble, and then coded in a quite detailed manner if they overlap in hand shape, orientation, the position of the gesture space, handedness, and motion. And this takes a lot of work. It's not easy to code that, so that's why we did it on a smaller set of the data. And what we found there is that exact form overlap is rare. I think if we take all of the 5 form criteria, it happens in less than 5% of the cases. So that means that people usually have a somewhat different gesture, and this might be simply because they happen to produce it differently, but it might also be meaningful variation in form. So this then comes to your question, do we miss something by using that approach? I think I could even argue rather the opposite. By using this more liberal operationalization of alignment and gesture, we find cases where people change the gesture a bit, as the example I showed in the presentation, where the earlier gesture was like this, and the second there was this additional movement. And this is a somewhat different gesture, but the difference in form is meaningful for people to negotiate understanding. And these kind of gestures might have been missed if we take this very strict form-based operationalization. So, but then of course it could still be that there might be gestural alignment in the data set that were part of the quantitative results that were perhaps, we don't always know what is going on there, of course. If they are not the same, it could be that they are talking about different aspects of a same fribble subpart. So this is a bit of the limitation of that choice, I think, and I used the qualitative analysis, picking out some examples to exemplify how variation in form is meaningful, but there will be more cases where we simply don't know what is going on. Yeah, but I would argue that if we use a strict way and only find gestures with exact form overlap without doing any qualitative work, we also don't know what's going on. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, my last question was whether this is what prevented you from looking at cross-modal alignment.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot that part. So I think I didn't look at cross-modal alignment, not necessarily as a sort of something that is difficult because of the specific operationalizations that we used, but something that is very hard to do at all, and it requires a lot of coding. I think this is perhaps the biggest challenge for if we want to go on with more quantitative methods and more automatic ways of detecting alignment. The cross-modal part, there is no machine that will tell you that this gesture is expressing the same thing as that word by the other person. So there is always human work involved there, so far, I think.
Thank you.
Okay. 2 minutes and 50 seconds left. I give the floor now to Professor Van Rooij, Chair.
Thank you very much. So let's see if it fits in these minutes. So my question is, again, a more outward-looking question. So not on methodology, but related to current events. As it may have caught your attention, that the last few months, that a new chatbot has been all the hype, or they also call it a conversational agent, ChatGPT, but there's also new variants already. And some people think that this kind of bot is on the path to human-level intelligence and therefore also human-level communication, I think, while others may think that these kinds of bots are just fancy autocomplete systems. And I don't know if you have given this any thought, and if you need some more information from me to maybe get thoughts started, let me know. But I was wondering how you, as a communication researcher, and you study mutual understanding, how people come to mutual understanding, how do you look at these kinds of bots and claims about them? And also, do you see important differences between how such bots communicate and how humans communicate? And if so, what important lessons may there be, both for AI or for cognitive science of communication? Any thoughts?
So the thoughts I've had so far about the ChatGPT, and especially the claim that it might show us how language is learned. I think there, if we look at how those models learn language by telling it to learn and reproduce language, is very different from how humans learn language. And this is such a big difference that we should not underestimate, I think.
The defense is hereby concluded. I give the floor once again to the candidate.
Having defended my dissertation to the best of my ability, I would like to thank the rector and my supervisor and co-supervisor, as well as those who have honored this ceremony with their presence.
Okay. Doctoral Examination Board retreats for its deliberations. On behalf of the Council of Deans of Radboud University Nijmegen, we have decided to award you the degree of doctor. I invite Professor Uturek to discharge the task assigned to her.
With the power entrusted by law to the doctorate board, I hereby confer upon you, Marlou Elisa Rasenberg, born in Maade en Drimmelen, the title of doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, to which are attached all the associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to academia and society. As proof thereof, I present you with this doctoral diploma, signed by the rector and the doctoral thesis supervisor and co-supervisor.
Please take a seat. The eulogy will be delivered by Professor Uturek and Dr. Dingemans.
Dear Marlou, Dr. Rasenberg, congratulations. I can't believe that we have been working together for around 5 years now, but I feel like I know you forever. In these last years, you have been such an integral part of our department that it's very difficult to imagine it without your presence. When we interviewed you for our Language and Interaction Project PhD position, I knew you had not worked with production data or with gesture before, or interaction. So I was a bit hesitant, but you moved into the task so fast that you went beyond all expectations. You mastered multimodal dialogue coding in this complex data set, dwelled with stats, managed how to use and analyze Kinect, as well as the theoretical aspects of alignment and repair in one go. Your theoretical integrated paper has been already cited almost 50 times in Google Scholar, even before you finished your thesis. You were, of course, not mastering in this time your own project, but you were also helping the big so-called CAP team in collecting 50 plus other pairs doing the same task, doing fMRI scanning, and writing a paper on this project as well on the side. In addition, you finished your thesis within the contract time, in spite of COVID, and got the famous GSH award, with some funds attached to it that we will all enjoy this afternoon. Congratulations for this as well, which few students in the PhD track get this award. In spite of all this hard work, you were mostly in a good mood, always up for lunch and social activities, helping people in the lab, and making sure at the same time you have your vacations right, doing your kayaking in the weekends and keeping healthy life. I think your chapters will be role models for future generations trying to understand the complexities of multimodal dialogues. I wish you all the best in your new fantastic job in Martin Institute, but we are very happy that you will still be in Nijmegen to visit us and hopefully join us for our infamous lunches now and then. And sorry, hartelijk gefeliciteerd met de family and your new partner.
Dr. Rasenberg, dearest Marlou, finally we can stop talking about this thesis and start talking about you. But I'm not ready to close the book just yet. On the very last page of your thesis, you cite an obscure paper by Furuyama, who wrote that people coordinate gesture and speech, and I quote, not only because they are trying to communicate effectively, but also because they are trying to communicate enjoyably. There are two things I like about this quote. First, that you found it. You're never satisfied citing only the usual suspects. You follow trails, you read widely and deeply. You find all these wonderful papers. This one is quite obscure indeed, by the way. It's 20 years old and has gotten exactly one citation in every year of his existence so far. So your thesis is now one of them. Well done. The second thing I like about this quote is this notion of doing something not just effectively but also enjoyably. This seems to me a pretty accurate description of your general way of working. You work effectively, but you also succeed in keeping things enjoyable. As for effectively, the evidence is before our eyes, of course. This beautiful thesis, even awarded the coveted Graduate School for Humanities Award. And Asli mentioned this already, it's no small feat, given that the past few years have basically gone by in kind of a pandemic blur. But it's not just about this outcome. You also made the process effective and enjoyable throughout. If, as the first data was coming in, we could count on you having some at the ready for a first look. If a method was new to you, we could count on you to figure it out. If I worried about reproducibility of a particular method, you already had documented your work in meticulous detail, as we also see in the appendices of your thesis, actually. If you wanted to dry run a presentation with us, the slides were already quite polished and we could focus on big picture questions instead, trusting you to take care of the details. No wonder, by the way, that you were asked so often to represent a larger project by way of your own work. Now, I don't know what the secret is to working well. I suspect it may actually be different for different people, but I do know one thing that we can learn from you. That is, to keep things both effective and enjoyable, it's key to alternate working and not working. And you are really good at that. Do excellent work, go on exciting holidays. Go organize an international workshop, then go on a hike, as we did in Hong Kong. Submit a paper, go kayaking in the Ardennes. Submit your thesis, disappear off the face of the earth for 2 months,
Go to Paris.
trekking from Geneva to the Mediterranean coast. And indeed, defend your dissertation. Of course, you're off for a nice weekend in Paris right away after this. And you always returned with new energy and new ideas. In fact, the very first email to me and Asle that I could find was this one, late 2017. Hope you're doing well. I just returned from holidays. And I'm excited to start next week. And when you came back from your hike last September, we felt so lucky to have you join our project and collaborate on exciting stuff. So folks, don't take it from me, take it from the freshly minted Dr. Rasenberg. Normalize taking time off. Explore other worlds and follow your curiosity. When you do things effectively and enjoyably, we've also seen it makes your work better. You've been invited to give talks in 6 places around the world. Your conceptual framework, chapter 1 of the thesis, repeatedly made the top 10 most downloaded papers in its journal. At the same time, you don't settle for easy wins. You like going off the grid, both outside the lab and in your academic work. So out of several options, you are in high demand. You picked a postdoc position that represents a radically new direction for your research. So, you know, we count as your PhD supervisors officially, but I think one special thing about you is that a lot of the time our meetings felt more like collegial brainstorms, proper work meetings in which you took the lead in looking at primary data, making plans for exciting papers, and thinking of new directions. It was a great pleasure and privilege to act as a supervisor, mentor, and collaborator. Marlou, once more, congratulations and thank you for being so effective and enjoyable. I'm sure you'll continue to surprise us.
I would now like to give the opportunity to Dr. Fischeroli to congratulate the new doctor.
So congratulations, Dr. Rasenberg. It's been a pleasure to follow your trajectory and to get the opportunity to discuss with you when you visited us in Aarhus. That was really giving, and also to receive your beautiful thesis and have the chance to once again go in depth into your very clear, very creative, and very thorough work. I hear that you're very good at celebrating and enjoying, but please do so because you really earned it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dear Dr. Rasenberg, on behalf of the Council of Deans, I would like to congratulate you, your partner, your parents, your brother, and other members of the family and friends here and in other parts of the world who are attending this ceremony via live stream. I also congratulate the supervisor and the co-supervisor on the completion of this nice research and interesting research. I ask you to stand up, as I would like to close the ceremony with traditional words. Gratias tibi agimus, omnipotens Deus, pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vivis et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum. We leave in procession, with the registrar leading, and the new doctor amongst us, followed by the supervisor and the members of the examination board. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your presence and attending this ceremony.